So as always, I'll go through the notes I have, but I want you guys to jump in with your comments too. Some personal finance topics are perpetually controversial, and they're not like, oh yeah, we disagree, but let's be friends kind of controversial. They're like, you've offended everything that I stand for, controversial, and my blood pressure is increasing as I read your disagreement. Uh, Now, I think the fact that there are controversial topics is not that interesting because there are controversial topics anywhere you look. But I think understanding the reasons why these topics are controversial is pretty interesting when you start to dig into the different layers of what makes them controversial. So we're going to go through what I think are some of the most controversial topics in personal finance, and we're going to try and explain the psychology behind the controversy, and then we're gonna give our thoughts. We're going to do renting versus owning a home, which is good timing actually, because the episode last week that has not come out yet at the time that we're recording is with Ellie Bracha, who's an academic that studies that topic. So this will be a good follow on from that. So that's one, renting versus owning a home. We're going to cover income investing, which includes dividend investing, covered calls, any preference for income over capital or over total return. And we're going to cover financial independence, retire early, or fire. Uh, so those are all topics where, like, anytime you get into discussion on the internet, at least, sometimes in real life too, people just get impassioned about their view and why it's right, and everybody else must be wrong. And it's really hard to have nuanced discussions about them, which is what we're going to try and do here. One of the common threads throughout these topics is that they're controversial because they go beyond understanding simple trade-offs. It's not as easy as it's not something that you can solve in a spreadsheet. They have deep psychological roots, and they form part of people's identities. And I think that there are also moral implications, or the perception of moral implications. Like you are good if you buy a home and bad if you rent. I think that filters into some of these topics, just as one
I'm,
example.
I'm curious because you've entered this debate fairly often in the community, but also on Reddit. Can you think of many cases where you've actually changed people's minds?
Oh, it happens all the time, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I know for a fact that lots of people have had their minds changed based on the content that we've made on this topic because they tell me. I don't know what the proportion is of people who have changed their minds versus not, but there are definitely a lot of comments whenever we cover that topic, from people who clearly didn't watch the video or read the paper or listen to the podcast episode or whatever, but are adamant that we're wrong about it. But for sure, like, it's people can change their minds. There's some interesting thoughts on that too, though, on how people process information when something disagrees with something that they have made part of their identity. Uh, so I'll just mention that. So with renting versus buying a home, it becomes part of someone's identity. Someone identifies as a homeowner, and someone who identifies as a homeowner and they feel that's something that's an important part of who they are. It's really hard for them to see alternative perspectives. And there's science behind what I just said. I'll get there in a second. Same with income investing. Someone might identify as a dividend investor, and there are many people who do because there are social media accounts and blogs and whatever about dividend investing, or with dividend investor in the title, and that has the same kind of implications. So those group identities. This is just kind of a precursor to the discussion about the controversial topics, but I think it's important. Those group identities matter to decision making. We learned about this from Jay Van Bavel, who's a past guest on this podcast. This paper is not his, but he referred to it during that episode. So there's this highly cited 2017 study that aimed to determine whether someone's perceived identity affects their ability to think critically. So the authors wanted to understand why public conflict over societal risks persist in the face of compelling and widely accessible scientific evidence. So it's like we have the evidence, we know what the kind of truth is or what the consensus is. Why do we still have so much conflict over those things? And I think this is not what their paper was about specifically, but I think this is directly applicable to personal finance topics where people's behavior is often at odds with academic research. So in the paper, they're looking at two possibilities. One is that people just don't have the cognitive ability to understand science. So you give someone, the theory of dividend irrelevance paper, and they just can't understand it. which is probably true. I've tried to read that paper. It's really hard to
I
understand.
was gonna say.
It's a bad example, bad example. So that's one possibility, that people just don't have the cognitive ability to understand science, which leads to controversy. The other possibility is that people with sufficient cognitive ability to understand science actually shut off their cognition when they're evaluating something that is at odds with their identity. And so what this study did is it presented people with a difficult problem that required them to draw valid causal inferences from empirical data. And the subjects who were better with numbers did substantially better when the data were presented as results from a study on a new skin rash treatment, which is a pretty benign topic. Like no one identifies with a specific type of skincare routine, or maybe they do. I don't know, but it's not a common one. um, so that's no surprise. People in the study who were better with numbers were better at solving this problem about the evidence on the skincare cream. Where the study gets interesting is that responses became less accurate when the exact same problem was presented as results from a gun control study rather than a skincare study. And where it's even more interesting is that the more numerate subjects in the study, the people who were better with numbers in the study, were more affected by the deterioration in accuracy than the less numerate ones. So what this suggests, and what the authors of the paper suggest, is that the more numerate subjects use their better quantitative reasoning capacity selectively to conform their interpretation of the data to the result most consistent with their beliefs. So that's a pretty scary thing to think about on a societal level. But after reading all the comments on my videos, like you mentioned, Cameron, and on other places on the internet, it makes so much sense that people just shut their brains off when something disagrees with a topic that they have made part of their identity. Okay.
I think on so many levels, right? People decide what they want to believe first at an emotional level, and then they look for evidence to support what they've already decided on, right? And we all do it to some extent. It's a very human thing to do. The more open-minded of us will have an initial view, and then when we dig into it more deeply, we can have our minds changed by the evidence. But all of us, I think, are wired to do that. It's sort of naive to think that we all make decisions by first assessing all of the data and the evidence dispassionately and then deciding, something. I mean, obviously, some of these investing questions are not quite as emotional as something like gun control, but certainly something like home ownership versus renting. It's, as you said, it's very much tied up in a person's identity. I'm not a person who owns a home. I'm a homeowner, and those are different things. And so that's why I think it's really difficult to get at some of these subtleties. And the idea is not to kind of hammer people with evidence. It's try to understand what makes them think this way, even if it doesn't necessarily line up with the evidence, and then just try to get them to think of something in a different way. And hopefully those beliefs will evolve.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you something interesting too that I've thought about. We talked about this in our episode that we did on renting versus owning a home a while ago, Dan. A lot of these topics, that someone who believes that they're a homeowner and they're really dedicated to making their home nice and taking good care of it, and it's a big part of who they are, they're probably going to have a reasonably good financial outcome. Like maybe even better than that specific person would have if they were forced to rent. And you go down the list, like dividend investing, same kind of thing. Like someone who becomes a really dedicated dividend investor, assuming they've built a reasonably well-diversified portfolio, they're probably going to have a pretty good financial outcome. And likewise for financial independence retirement. Like if someone saves 50% of their income and builds up a big portfolio and is living on a really tight budget, but they're happy, I mean, hey, that's great. They're probably going to have a great outcome. But that's, following the advice can probably lead to good outcomes, but it doesn't mean it's the only advice that everybody should follow, which is, I think, what a lot of people get caught up in. Everybody should do this because it's right. And that's kind of...
Or everybody should do this for some specific reason, that when you scratch the surface, you find out the reasoning is faulty, right? It's not that renting or buying is a bad decision, but you can certainly frame that decision in misleading ways and cause people to make bad decisions. Dividend investing, for sure, the same thing. So
the fervor for dividend investing, though, can certainly lead to great behavior. I mean, people love it.
Yeah.
Right? The whole get paid while you wait. I'm getting this much dividends per month. I get to reinvest it. That gives you more energy to be more committed to the strategy and want to put more resources, more savings behind that, which will obviously help your balance sheet down the road. That's a great outcome to what might be arguably a suboptimal strategy, but still if it works. And this is something that Morgan Housel has talked about a lot. People are messy. You can't spreadsheet everything, right?
Yeah. On dividend investing, a lot of the dividend investors are anti-financial advisor. And that's interesting because investing in a dividend portfolio probably leads to much better behavior. And so for a crowd who is anti-advisor for whatever reason, the fact that they're investing the way that they are is probably actually a half decent replacement for having an advisor on that specific topic on investing. Still, it's not going to build their financial plan for them, but